section of the Gita that we're in the middle of. And we're on text 49 today, but we're going to back up just a little bit. When beginning this new section, Krishna says, I've explained it to you according to Sankhya, from a philosophical point of view. I've explained it to you. That you are not the body. Now I'm going to explain it to you from the point of view of Buddhi Yoga. It's important to understand that the Sankhyas and the yogis, at least at the time of the Mahabharata, were fighting. They were two competing schools of philosophy. Now they are viewed as one school by students of Hinduism. In fact, the school is oftentimes called the Sankhya Yoga School. And so, but if you go far enough back, at least to the time of the Mahabharata, the text that the Gita is a part of, these two schools were at loggerheads. They were philosophical opponents. Please close that door. Thank you. Maybe leave it open so we know who's coming. Have they left? So, the Sankhyavadis, the Sankhyas, they were philosophers who would sit around and discuss at length the distinction between spirit and matter. And the yogis, in contrast to how they're viewed today, the yogis were more action-oriented, more activist, more this-worldly, less passive. And so the Sankhyavadis were passive and theoretical and philosophical. And the yogis, in contrast, were practical and active and this worldly, and were not mere philosophers. They did stuff. They moved. So in the Gita, one of the things that Krishna does is he collapses the difference between these two competing schools of thought and attempts to harmonize them, which is very much in line with the idea behind Vedanta. Vedanta is also an ancient school of Indian philosophy that spoke of a samanvaya, a grand universal theory, a unifying, complete, synergistic school that attempted to take the best pieces of the other schools and sew them together and demonstrate how the schools which were at odds with one another were at odds because they had not seen the big picture, and Vedanta attempted to create a framework within which the best pieces of the other schools could be appreciated and the deficiencies of the other schools could be jettisoned. And Vedanta further made the claim that this is what the Upanishads had originally taught. Vedanta is based on the Upanishads as a revelatory body of texts. And so there was a school of Vedic wisdom called Vedanta that Krishna is espousing. And that school took the warring factions and brought them together under one roof by jettisoning and rejecting parts of those traditions which were considered to be unnecessary and accepting essential pieces of the various traditions in a way that was synergistic. Maybe instead of merely syncretistic, instead of just cobbling them together, it chose to really get to the essence of things and separate what mattered from what didn't, separate details from principles, and separate the essence from things which were non-essential, the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And not only did Vedanta try to do that, but it attempted to argue, or it did argue, quite successfully, if you look at the history of Hinduism, it argued that this is what the Vedas were teaching. This is what the Vedas were always intending to teach. And that the Vedanta was the proper interpretation of the Veda, and these other schools, it's gone off the rails, so to speak. So it was re-emphasizing the importance of the revealed text, the revealed word, the scripture, and at the same time it was simultaneously an attempt to synergistically resolve the differences between the various schools. Knowing this, that when you see Krishna arguing from the point of view of Sankhya and then from the point of view of yoga, you can see him laying the foundation or sowing the seeds which will inevitably enable him to reconcile the two traditions and show that they are in fact one. And later on he says, Sankhya and yoga are one. Later on he makes just such a claim. So what we're seeing here as he's fleshing out the Sankhya position, what's the Sankhya position according to the Gita? Yes? You're not the body, you are a soul. It's a philosophical point. Then yoga, Buddhi yoga, becomes the application of that point in your daily life. And so again, yoga is active and Sankhya is passive. But instead of being active versus passive, it becomes cognitive facets which then inform behavior, a theory which then gets put into practice, an idea which then gets applied, and yoga becomes the application of the ideal of Sankhya in the real world in your day-to-day life. And Krishna says there's no loss or diminution. Just a little bit of this Dharma will deliver you. But don't think it's cheap. You have to be very, very focused in your mind to be able to pull this off. And in fact, the Vedas are an antagonist. The Vedic literatures were largely about manifesting. Now, the idea behind manifesting these days is that if you think you make a vision board and you think about things you want, and because you cut out of a newspaper or a magazine a fancy car and a fancy house and a fancy spouse, and you glue them onto a board or you tape them onto a board, that somehow or other has value. Then maybe you look at it and you want those things. Focus. And then magically those things appear in your life. Which is just I think it's a very deficient and childish worldview. you need to go ahead and work and come up with strategic planning in order to achieve your goals, and give yourself a sufficient amount of time, and perhaps even refine your goals by thinking about what's really important in life. And it seems very childish to just put together a Christmas list of things you want and then expect that those things will be manifested. I had somebody come here to the temple just recently and told me, I'm manifesting a mridanga. And I said, oh, okay, good luck with that. And he kind of looked at me like I was betraying him because I wasn't then going, oh, let me give you a drum. He looked at me like disturbed, like he saw his eyes get bewildered and it got bigger, and he was like hating me. Because he had this idea, I'll just tell them I'm manifesting a mridanga and then they'll hand me one. And so let's call that the bad side of manifesting. The good side of manifesting is maybe you put together a vision board. Maybe you don't make it so childish and immature and materialistic. It's got like a Ferrari on or something like that. You can't even pay your rent. Maybe you refine your goals and become a little bit more, I don't know, centered or grounded or deep. And then maybe once you've figured out your vision board, that then turns into a strategic plan. And you begin to work and create SMART goals for yourself, which are specific and measurable, et cetera, and accountable, and I think reasonable and time-bound. Is that what it is? SMART goals, yeah. And so then, you figure out what your KRAs are, your key result areas. You put together a plan. Maybe your first thing isn't a vision board, which is just kind of childish. Maybe you go ahead and just do a mission statement like every smart person in the world does, and every smart corporation does. What do you actually stand for? Maybe you shouldn't just cut things out of a newspaper that you want in a childish way, but take the time to develop a mission statement. How about that? And then, maybe do a SWOT analysis, strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Maybe do something, something like that, and then figure out the project of your life and how to manage it and move forward, and then put some skin in the game and actually work on it. I think that probably yields just a much higher probability of achieving success than merely trying to mentally masturbate enough that the whole world manifests in front of you like some kind of weird hermaphroditic delusion that's going to birth everything you ever wanted. Sorry for being a little gross and also critical. Krishna says you got to be focused, and he tells you what the enemy is. It's almost like a SWOT analysis. The enemy is the Vedas, and the Vedas were largely focused on manifesting. Prabhuji, you have to be on your phone? I'm talking. Look at me. Otherwise, you're just sitting here looking at your phone. What's the value? The Vedas were largely about manifesting, but not quite just that you think, I want this, and then you get it. The Vedas had rituals that you would perform in order to achieve certain things in life. And in fact, a huge majority, let's say, of the Vedas were very much this worldly, and they were about magical formulas that would get you what you wanted. You would perform yajna. You would ritually offer things in sacrifice to the appropriate deity, and then you would supplicate to that deity, and then the deity, satisfied by the ritual offering, would then give you what you wanted. And this was a early idea behind manifesting. It wasn't just whatever I want, I will get, but there was some idea that if you follow a course of action, not just a course of sweat off your own back, but a course of action that you perform a yajna, you supplicate, you follow the Veda, you surrender to a priest. It was a whole tradition, a way society was run. Not totally dissimilar to traditional Catholicism and the power of the Pope and the Church to give salvation and give indulgences and forgive sins and reconcile you. And there's like this, these priests and shamans, in all cultures, were these power brokers who were understood to be in touch with some higher principle, and that if you wanted to enjoy materially, you would surrender and supplicate to them and bend the knee to them, and then they would, with their wizardry and their technologies, they would intercede with higher powers and get you what you wanted in life. You guys following this? It's kind of old world ritual religion. Anywhere you look, you'll find this kind of stuff. Krishna is super critical of that. And he says, in fact, this is the enemy of what I'm teaching, Buddha Yoga, the yoga of enlightenment, the yoga of intelligence. This is the enemy because it focuses you on material things. You're all over the place, and you won't have that focus and that determination you need to focus on one thing, which is spiritual emancipation. And he even goes so far as to say, you won't be given samadhi. You won't find the resolution. Samadhau na vidyate. Vyasayatmaka buddhi samadhau na vidyate. The resolute determination you would require for your meditation will not occur because bahu shaka hyanantascha, because your mind is going in many different directions, but in fact you need to be vyasayatmaka buddhi ekeha. You have to be in this world of one focused mind on the goal of samadhi, on the goal of meditation. And he even goes further and says, what value is there really in a well when you're in front of a huge body of water? That's the value of the Vedas, if you're talking to a Brahmin who really knows the import of the Vedas. And what is the import of the Vedas? Here it is. We're going to reread the previous two texts that we read last week. Kamani eva dikaraste. You have a right to do your karma, your duty. Mapaleshu kadachna. But you don't at any time get the fruits of your work. It's a duty-based ethic, not a results-based ethic. You're not doing something to get something. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do. Makarma palehetu bur. Don't try to be the cause of, don't let it be that you're motivated by this idea that you're going to get a particular result. Don't try to enjoy the results when they come, and don't let that be your motivation, that you want a particular result. So not only is it you don't get to enjoy the results when they come, which is a behavioral thing, but you shouldn't be thinking of yourself as the cause of the results. You should just do your duty and let what happens happen. And then mate sangha astu karmani. And don't get attached to not doing your duty either. Because once you realize you don't get to enjoy the fruits, you don't even get to think of yourself as the doer, then you might want to get lazy, and so don't be lazy either. When you look at this, you can see how Krishna is espousing the yoga position. But he's connected it to the philosophical idea that you're not the body, and therefore that's the reason to not be attached. If you are the body and you are the cause of everything and there is nothing above you and you aren't part of something bigger than yourself, then you are in fact the cause of all the results, and you should get credit or blame for the results, and you should live in this world going up and down the roller coaster ride trying to make everything that you want happen and not realizing there's anything beyond that. You're a materialist. But if you know you're not the body, then you know there's something bigger going on. You're part of something bigger than yourself. And that creates a little bit of a loosening of that knot. And you can start to do your duty without being hopelessly attached to the results. Did you guys follow that? Then Krishna says, Yoga stakuru karmani. Do your work in yoga, situated in yoga. Sangnam tyaktva dhananjaya. Giving up your attachment. Siddhya siddhyo samobhuva. Being the same, whether you succeed or fail. Samadvam yoga uchate. That equanimity is called yoga. So yoga is not just doing your duty, but it's the equanimity of doing your duty while not being attached to the result. Because the reality is, there are many factors you can't account for. That is the reality. You're dealing with other people. Other people have free will. We sometimes think we live in a solipsistic world where we get to control people, persuade people, and force people to bend to our will, or persuade them and seduce them into bending to our will. But the reality is people actually have free will, and sometimes they just do what they're going to do, totally independent of your machinations and your attempt to manipulate them. And maybe if you're a big fish in a small pond, you can have a high degree of control over your universe. But if you want to spread out, what goes along with spreading out is that you have a whole lot less influence on and you become a small fish in a big pond. Like Donald Trump was wildly popular, and half the U.S. was into him. A little less than half, but almost half. And that's why it's wild how our two-party election process works. Everybody gets about half the vote. It's really like, did you get 52 or 48%, or 51.5 to 48.5%? That's really what we're debating at this point. Nobody ever gets like 60% versus 40%. That just doesn't exist. It's well beneath 55-45. It's more in the 51-52 versus 48-49. Sometimes even less than that. Anyway, Trump was wildly popular in the U.S., but the rest of the world really hates him and considers him to be... It's amazing if you travel, how poorly people think of Bush, 1N2, HNW, and how poorly they think of Trump. How unpopular they are, for instance, say in Europe. You're kind of a big fish in a small pond, but in the larger pond of the world, the larger lake of the world, to win that approval rating with almost half of the population, you got to give up the approval rating of a huge swath of the educated and civilized rest of the world. Do you guys follow that? There are probably some regions, like regions that have warlords and strong men running the country where they probably appreciate Trump. Maybe areas of Russia and the Caucasus, Central Asia, kind of those sort of warlord type places, they might appreciate Trump because he has many of the despotic features of your average run-of-the-mill dictator. This isn't a critique of the Republican Party per se, but I'm just trying to explain how to win popularity with one group, you might give it up with another. To win influence with one group of people, you lose it with another. And really, the bigger you go in the world, the more you just can't control for everybody, can't win everybody. There's just also your karma and your genetics and how those genetics manifest, and epigenetics and health factors and other people spitting on you and giving you COVID and just so many things, reversals and recession, and the stock market going cattywampus, and Bitcoin, losing 2/3 of its value practically overnight, and the stock market being down 25%, just boom. And then of course everybody's like, I said that was coming, but just as many pundits said that wasn't coming and said it was coming, and so they flipped a coin, and the guys who flipped a coin and said heads won, and the guys who flipped a coin and said tails lost. But nobody ever says I was wrong. They just wait until they keep flipping the coin until they get it right, and then they're like, hey, I was right all along, just see. And I can't remember who the Nobel laureate who said this was, but he said, if you're a Nobel laureate, please understand you're just as dumb as the next guy outside of your field of speciality. So even if you were some sort of incredible theoretical economist who was able to predict with a high degree of certitude decades and decades of what's going on in the world vis-a-vis its economy, then how about your understanding of cancer research? How about your understanding of music? How about your understanding of psychology? Those things are going to be radically deficient because the very thing which gave you an incredible insight into one subject left you being not a Renaissance man, but a master in your field and a buffoon in the others. Did you guys follow that? So the principle behind yoga is the idea that you're not the body. And that fuels a worldview where you can do your duty but not be attached to the result. And so the way Krishna is explaining this, doing your duty without being attached, and how it's connected to yoga will be fleshed out later, but the connection is already quite apparent. That equanimity of knowing you're not the body, that zenith which would allow Arjuna to fight without being attached to the results, without worrying about the results, based on a bigger picture that you're the body, you're the soul and not the body. That same idea now extends into other areas of your life besides the battlefield, and you're able to do your job or your duty, whatever it might be, even though it's difficult. And so in this way, Krishna is beginning to sew together and marry the idea of you're not the body, you are a soul, there is something bigger going on, you're not in charge, everything doesn't depend on you, you are not the maker of all reality. He's sewing that together, that detachment together, with then going back into the world in a more informed way and participating in the world, albeit without driving yourself insane by your inability to control things. I mean, look no further than old age, disease, and death for all the ways in which you have no control. For the spread of pandemics and things like that. And then you're like, well, I would have gotten it right. Yeah, but then there's all these other people and you can't control them. So you can't control earthquakes and old age and disease and death because you may be predisposed towards a heart condition, eat really healthy and still get a heart attack or a stroke or an aneurysm or so many things. And just, eating a macrobiotic diet isn't going to save you. What to speak of all the other people in the world who then do all sorts of stuff you can't control. And so the only path to sanity in terms of being in this crazy charnel house of the material world is to learn to be happy just doing your thing. That's what Krishna's trying to explain is yoga. He actually says, samatvam yoga uche. This equanimity while doing your work is called yoga. The equanimity comes from Sankhya, and then the doing of your duty comes from yoga, and the two schools come together. And we normally think of yoga as passive because we don't consider pranayama and asana to be actions. But there were schools of Indian thought which just merely philosophized. And the yoga school, with its emphasis on personal austerity and waking up early and doing asana and doing pranayama, that school seems to be an active school. Not active in the sense of it was a grossly materialistic school doing, student activism on campus, but it was active in the sense of it had you getting up in the morning and doing something besides just thinking and meditating all day in sort of a Zen Buddhist type way. Keep, text 49, keep all abominable activities far distant by this Buddha yoga, and in that consciousness surrender unto the Lord. Those who want to enjoy the fruits of their work are misers. It doesn't sound like Buddha yoga anymore. It sounds like bhakti yoga. That's Prabhupada. He's the director, and he's spoiling the movie. He's not letting Krishna tell you about bhakti chapters down the road, which is what Krishna will do. And Krishna's just sort of foreshadowing bhakti But Prabhupada forces bhakti to be made public much earlier than Krishna does. And so what Krishna says here is, Buddha Sharanam Anvicha. Anvicha means strive after. Icha means desire, and anu means to follow. Follow after that desire. Take refuge in. Sharana means refuge. Take refuge in that buddhi. Buddha means in that consciousness. Take refuge in this consciousness that you're not the body, that you're not the doer, that you should do your duty but not be attached. Take shelter of that. Take refuge in that. Strive after that. Look for that. Try for that. Because Durena Hyavaram Karma Buddha Yogat, Buddhi Yogat. Because this karma, just trying to enjoy the world, is inferior and poor and weak, and it's much less than. It should be kept at a distance from you, and it's far distant from, it's inferior to, and much worse than Buddhi Yoga. Buddhi Yoga, then Buddhi Yoga. And because this karma of just trying to enjoy this world, by the sweat off your own back, is such an inferior, weaker, less glorious, more pathetic way of living your life, then you should reject it and rather take refuge in this idea that Krishna has espoused and this notion he's put forward. The notion that you should do your duty but not be attached to the results. Balahetava, those who are trying to create fruits, those who are searching after the fruits, those who follow a results-based ethic where they're just trying to create results, they are kripanas. They are impoverished and weak and poor. Misers. So Prabhupada took this idea of take refuge in, because taking refuge is a cornerstone of bhakti. And Krishna uses the term refuge when he's talking about bhakti and future. And so Prabhupada, surrender unto the Lord, take refuge in the Lord. Later on, Krishna will say, Dadami buddhi yogam tam, I will give you buddhi yoga if you serve me. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti. Purvakam. If you serve me with love and devotion, you worship me and serve me and do bhakti to me, then I will give you buddhi yoga. So now all you have to do is surrender to Krishna later on in the Gita, and he'll give you the buddhi yoga as an accoutrement, as a byproduct. So instead of the ladder upwards, it becomes a mercy from above, grace. Instead of trying to walk up a ladder, rather you just open your heart and you become the recipient of grace. So there is works versus grace, which eventually gets contrapositioned in the Gita. And the works of the Gita turn into opening your heart to divinity, and it becomes a tradition of grace. So that's another evolution which takes place in the text. It's a very, very full and complete text, which deals with most ideas around religion that you might encounter if you look at the religious traditions of the world. It speaks to those traditions and the core of those traditions and core ideas which might have gotten fleshed out, works versus faith, or works versus grace. That's here. There's an evolution. But not so much just, faith without works is dead, like a very kind of simplistic statement in the Bible, in the book of James. Paul was all about faith, no works. James was, no, you got to do faith and works. But there's much more of a argumentation which takes place in the New Testament, what to speak of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Torah, how much argument there is between the different prophets and such, or the different apostles, But here you find a systematic presentation where one thing leads to another and one thing evolves to another. And so Prabhupada is adding in these ideas early on in the text, because he knows the same language gets used again later on and things are added to it. And so he doesn't want you to get lost in the gradual process. And he gives you the result from the beginning, tells you about the foreshadowing, tells you about the introduction of ideas before they've been fully fleshed out, so that you're not left having to read halfway or three-quarters of the way through the Gita to make sure you've understood it, but every purport gives you the conclusion of the Gita and references. And this is very common for commentators. They will take later ideas and then put them into their commentary to the earlier ideas so that the students can see how those ideas are fleshed out and not be left trying to figure it out on their own. It's very common amongst the commentators. A person engaged in Buddhi Yoga, a person yoked to Buddhi Yoga, rids himself of both good and bad reactions, even in this world. That's an interesting idea, that karma is good and bad, and you want to ultimately transcend both good and bad karma. Well, then what happens to you? That'll come up in the next verse. Therefore, you should yoke yourself to yoga, because yoga is the art of work. Therefore, strive for yoga, which is the art of all work. Yoga karmasu kaushalam. Yoga is the art of how to work in this world without becoming hopelessly attached. It's a skill. It's a technique for how to live in this world but not be of it, how to work in this world but not become seduced by it or confused by it or enmeshed in it. How to be in this world but not of it. So this is another definition of yoga. Yoga is the art of work. So we have two definitions of yoga given. Both of them are very much linked to these ideas about the nature of the world and aloofness from the world while still participating in it. By thus engaging in Buddhi Yoga, great sages or devotees free themselves from the results of work in the material world. In this way they become free from the cycle of birth and death and attain a stage beyond all miseries. Karma jam buddhi yukta hi palam tyaktva manishina. Manishina, wise people. Tyaktva palam, they throw off the fruit. They throw away the fruit. They don't try to enjoy the fruit. Buddhi yukta, because they're yoked to buddhi. So they don't try to enjoy the fruit which is born of karma. Buddhi, karma jam palam, the fruit which is born of karma, the results of your actions, they don't try to enjoy it because they're yoked to something higher. They're yoked to this buddhi, this awakeness, this idea that they're not the body, and they've awakened that, so they're moving in the world, but they're not too attached to what goes on. Karma jamma vinir mukta, they're freed from the bondage of birth in this world and being enmeshed in this world. Palam gachanti anamayam, and they go to that place which is free of all pain and suffering. This world is intimately linked, intrinsically linked to suffering. To live in this world means to suffer. But there's a higher place that you go to. So it's not mere stoicism or the best use of a bad bargain, but rather there's something much greater that you can achieve as a soul by operating like this in the world. And so whether it's heaven, or whether it's a spiritual world, or whether it's this Zen-like state of living as a soul, you're going to a place which is free from the normal perturbations that people go through over the course of a life. By getting enmeshed in this world and the losses and gains and ups and downs, you're not affected by them as much. I'm going to tangent just a bit. I saw a rabbi preaching yesterday. It may have been on Instagram. I don't remember, but somehow I saw a rabbi preaching. And he was saying that the reason why bad things happen to good people is because if you were just being good because good things happened, then you're not really good. And so to prove your goodness to God, you have to do good things even when bad things are happening to you. And that's the only way to prove your goodness. And therefore God had to create the world where bad things happen to good people so that people had a chance to be truly good. Because otherwise you wouldn't be able to be truly good. You would just be doing business. There'd be no way that, everybody would know you got to do this, you'd follow the rules. I thought it was I've heard the argument before, but hearing the argument again, I appreciated it. I liked what he was trying to do. He was trying to get rid of the problem of evil and the stain it throws on an all-good and all-powerful God. He was trying to argue that God's kind to us by having us suffer, thereby giving us a chance to be really good. And in this way he's trying to escape the problem of evil and the problem of suffering without reference to karma, without reference to what goes around comes around. Which is strange because the Torah says, as you sow, so shall you reap. And so it does seem to espouse something similar to the law of karma in its own language, but somehow or other he dispensed with that and he made this argument. I appreciated his exuberance to make the argument, his conviction. I'm sure there was a bunch of old ladies sitting there nodding their heads and saying, yes, yes. He probably felt pretty good. He was a good orator. He was a good speaker. But I think there's a bunch of flaws with his argument. You're nodding your head. That would indicate to me that you know what the flaws of his argument are hidden. So if you're agreeing with me, then you must know what the flaws are. So what are the flaws with his presentation? What's one flaw?
It doesn't align with all good God.
Why doesn't it allow an all good God? God wants you to be able to be truly good. The only way for you to be truly good is if he throws some curveballs at you and then you can choose to be truly good. He would be removing your free will if he made just everything super clean. Good things led to good results, bad things led to bad results, and therefore an all good God loves you enough that he created a world where bad stuff happens to you even though you don't deserve it, thereby giving you a chance to transcend results and just do the right thing for the right reason, independent of the results, and that gives you a chance to be truly good, and therefore God's kind to you. That's the core of his argument. So only by ignoring the core of his argument and just pretending he didn't say it can you make the point you made. Stop. You made a poor argument. You don't get to go again. We're live. We got people watching. They can't hear you speak. You got to be more succinct in what you say. And if you gaff it hard and then try to work your way out of a hole, that's not what we're doing. You strike out, then you're struck out. You have to wait for your other turn at bat. You don't get to now go, let me have another turn at bat. It's not happening. You hit the ball, it goes. You didn't even strike out. You just hit the ball like a little tiny pop-up fly ball that just got nabbed by the pitcher. Didn't require the infield to catch it. Now, who thinks they know what's wrong with the good rabbi's argument? All right?
What about like a child or baby with a congenital heart defect? Doesn't really address that in any way.
Okay, small baby, congenital heart defect, doesn't have a chance to choose good. Then You argue, well, the baby already always goes back to heaven. That's the argument that people make. In fact, even in the Vedic literatures, you don't burn a baby's body if they die below the age of like 3. You bury it because it has no karma. It doesn't require to be burned. The burning is to burn up the karma of your body. And small children are not burned. They're buried. They're considered to be pure because they haven't had a chance to do anything wrong yet because they're too young. Like animals, they're generally freed from many legal concepts like rape and murder and so on and so forth. They're not held responsible. Even if you have to kill a dog or put it down because it kills somebody, you don't actually think the dog's evil or something like that. So small children don't have a chance to choose. If you say they automatically go back to heaven, which is what this Jew would probably say, then you're left with a weird situation where you should kill all children. And we should just kill the entire planet because then everybody goes back to heaven. And that's the fault of negative utilitarianism, is that if you want to end suffering, just kill everybody. That's the goal of life, because if you just kill everybody with a bullet to the head, then they'll suffer less. They won't suffer at all. They'll just turn off. Whether they stay alive, inevitably they'll go through some suffering. So that's the rebuttal, and then your rejoinder to that rebuttal. So that's an argument. You can extend it, forget small, but how about the two people don't suffer the same? Right? What a capricious deity. Maybe he makes everybody suffer equally, but to make one person suffer more and somebody else not suffer much at all, that's a dent in the all-goodness. That's a better way to make your argument. Good. That's a good argument. Solid. Yeah.
This argument seems to make God not all-powerful, because I don't know why the only way to demonstrate goodness would be that you have to suffer in the way that people suffer.
Yeah, is there a way to allow people to choose things without them creating some suffering? Is there a way to allow people free will and not let them suffer? Because Shri seems to think there's a way to allow people to have free will and not have them suffer. So what you're really critiquing is karma. And you're critiquing our tradition's answer too. God should make everybody happy all the time and then still give us a chance to have free will, but the baseline should be happiness and joy, and there should be no need for suffering for anybody. And no matter what choices we make, there shouldn't be any suffering that's created. I've repeated myself now, maybe 3 times. Do you finally got it? Okay, that's a swing and a miss. A better way to make your argument is that God can do better than making people suffer for no reason whatsoever to varying degrees. What would be a way that God could allow us to have free will, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, but not just let us suffer to varying degrees for no good reason, which would seem to make God super arbitrary? What would be a way that God could allow us to have free will, allow us to make mistakes, allow us to pay for those mistakes, give us a chance to learn, not force us to do the right thing necessarily, but not just let somebody who doesn't deserve to suffer. What would be a way to do that? Karma. Karma is a different idea, which is superior to the rabbi's idea, because karma holds that you get what you deserve, no more, no less, doesn't compromise your free will, and at the same time still gives you a chance to be good. Do you follow? Also, where's the idea that if you know something is going to get you a good result, you'll do it? I mean, that's not true. How many times in your own life have you known something is bad and it's going to get a bad result, and then you do it anyway just because you want to do something bad, even though you know it's not going to serve you in the long term? So this whole idea that knowing if bad actions lead to bad results, makes people devoid of free will. I don't agree. Maybe God being present in front of you and immediately smiting you and smoting you the moment you stepped wrong, that would give everybody like a super traumatized existence and they would be lacking free will. But a little bit of time, a little bit of forgetfulness, people can make all sorts of mistakes even though they know that, they're ultimately going to pay for them. So I don't even agree with the principle that the knowledge that you'll suffer if you do something wrong means no one will be able to do anything wrong. I don't believe that. I believe a little bit of forgetfulness mixed in, a little bit of lust mixed in, a little bit of, choose your own adventure, and people can have some idea that what they're doing is wrong and still do it anyway and suffer and still keep going back and doing the same thing over and over again and suffering and riding that wheel and having plenty of free will. Did you follow that? I'm questioning the very notion that he starts with as his premise. I'm pointing out that karma is a better system which sounds like a much better deity. I'm running with what you said about congenital heart defects and just bring it up to the inequality of suffering across the board, which would indicate an arbitrary and mean God who makes it for one person but not for another. In this way, I think the idea behind karma is vastly superior philosophically and has no holes in it from the perspective of theism, whereas most other versions of theism that try to get around the problem of evil end up failing miserably, like the good rabbi's version. Do you guys follow that? So here we have the idea you want to rid yourself of both good and bad karma, because ultimately all karma is bad. You want to rid yourself of both good and bad karma because ultimately all karma is bad. It's a very high idea. That good things are also bad because they bind you to the world. And that transcendence is beyond mere good and bad of this world. It's a really radical, subversive, super advanced idea about spirituality. And Krishna just deploys it as almost like an obvious truth that everybody he's talking to already knows. Well, you'll free yourself of both good and bad karma. And everyone's like, yeah. Whereas if you were to say it to somebody else, they'd be like, what do you mean? Whoa, I don't want to free myself of good karma. And so there's such a lacking of really deep thought about the nature of reactions, both good and bad in this world, and how they both bind you, and the problem of reactions in general, and what that says about God, and how to liaise this stuff and navigate it. I'm so surprised by the inability of other traditions to really look at this. The problem is they got some lousy texts, and their lousy texts don't have the good ideas in them. So then they got to kind of run with what they got. Otherwise, they'll be accused of syncretistically, eclectically adopting certain principles that aren't in their text from other traditions to complete their traditions. And nobody wants to do that. So they're just sort of limited to playing with the cards in the hand they were dealt. You follow? Anyway, I wanted to do a little comparative religious discussion. I thought there'd be some value in that. And then Krishna's going to wrap this up. We're going to just read a couple more verses and wrap this up ourselves. When your intelligence has passed out of the dense forest of delusion, you shall become indifferent to all that has been heard and all is to be heard. When you're no longer so attached to this material world, you'll become somewhat callous towards it. And then those flowery words of the Vedas promising you enjoyment and heavenly delights, they won't attract you anymore. Shrotasya, shrutasya cha. What will be heard, what has been heard. Something you may not know, but this idea of will be heard and has been heard specifically is in reference to the Shruti. The Vedic literature is called Shruti. The original Vedic texts are called Shruti. And those are those texts that Krishna has been criticizing all along for promising material aggrandizement and manifestings based on ritual observances. And Krishna's attacking those ideas and replacing it with this hybridized version, this unified version of Sankhya and Yoga. And now Krishna makes reference to that again. Remember how I mentioned this in the beginning in the introduction? How there was the religious texts of the Vedas were about manifesting and enjoying through a ritual culture things in this world. Krishna's now continuing with that critique. You have to be callous. You have to not want good karma. in order to practice the Gita. Because the Gita is about transcending karma, good and bad. And unless you're signed up for that, you won't be stoic and zen enough to resist the temptations of this material world. And there's a certain callousness and indifference that you require towards the entire material endeavor. Did you guys follow that? When your mind is no longer disturbed by the flowery language of the Vedas, and when it remains fixed in the trance of self-realization, then you will have attained yoga. When you reject the shruti, the materialistic words, when you disregard it, and you become unflinchingly, nischala means unmoving, and achala also means unmoving. They're both two ways. When you become absolutely fixed, nischala, achala, when you become fixed, your buddhi becomes fixed, samadha, in meditation. Tada, at that time, yogam avapsyasi, you'll have achieved yoga. Yoga is this callousness towards the material world, this callousness towards good and bad karma, this attachment to doing your duty no more, no less, this indifference towards results, this lack of a desire to be the cause of results, this understanding that all the material world with its good and bad karma is to be transcended. When you become fixed in that consciousness, then you've achieved yoga. And that concludes Krishna's initial discussion on yoga. What it looks like, what you have to do, what the qualifications are, the specific features of it, contrasting it to other possibilities. And now we're left with a powerful idea of yoga. What is yoga? Yoga is equanimity. Equanimity what? While doing your duty. What does it mean, equanimity while doing your duty? Whether you succeed or fail, you don't care. Whether you're victorious or you're defeated, you don't care. Krishna's first verse, Jaya Ajaya, in victory or defeat. Doesn't matter. Siddhya Siddhyo, whether you're successful or whether you fail. Lab alab, whether you gain or lose. Krishna began this whole section with that verse. Do your duty. Fight for the sake of fighting without considering victory or loss, gain or defeat. And he's fleshed out his idea. What do you need? Got to be one-pointed. What am I going to get for it? You're going to transcend this world. It's really good. How good is it? Imagine you had a lake. How much value is there in a well when you have a whole lake? That's what the Vedas are like compared to this knowledge I'm giving you. What's the enemy of it? This being super into this material world and getting bewildered by our religious texts or promises of pomp and circumstance and all sorts of heavenly delights and all sorts of winning that gets you all attached to this material world, hearth and home and so on and so forth. What I got to do? Your duty, no more, no less. You can't not do your duty, can't even cognitively be thinking you're making it happen, and you can't be trying to enjoy the fruits. It's way superior to most people's karma. Just doing things. What does it do? It frees you of good and bad karma. Yep, even good karma is bad karma. And when you get out of this thicket, this forest of illusion, you'll become indifferent even to the words of the Vedas. You'll disregard them. And then when your consciousness becomes fixed, unmoving, unflinching in all circumstances, at that point you've achieved yoga and transcended karma. And you're living in this world but not being of this world. Thank you very much, IGTV. Okay, feedback?